Welcome, friends and foes, survivors and killers. Let's sit around the campfire together and talk about Dead by Daylight. Specifically, the brand new killer in the Doomed Course chapter, Portia May, better known as the Houndmaster. And her dog Snug, of course. So the Houndmaster PTB just dropped out of nowhere. I had a whole video on trap killers planned out to finish over the weekend, timing over until the 12th or 13th when the PTB was meant to drop. But she's here early. No teasers, minimal leaks, just a dog woman jump scare, out of the blue, and that's really exciting. I'm not sure if this was meant to be an intentional choice of new strategy, a shock and awe, out of nowhere approach designed to capture instant hype, or just a result of behaviour firing the person who made the unknown teasers, so they didn't have any prepared for Houndmaster to begin with. I'll let you decide which it might be. But regardless, the lack of hype period is not the only way in which Houndmaster stands out from the recent crop of releases. Over the past 18 months, we've had an extreme drought of original content and a deluge of licensed content. Taking into account the 3 licensed survivors we've had lately, we've had 7 licensed content drops compared to only 3 originals. And of those 3, Houndmaster is the only human of the group. She's not a cryptid or a robot, but a woman with a dog. And to find the last human killer released before her, we'd had to look for Skull Merchant, who released in March 2023. And she's a historical domain killer, the kind of thing we used to get all the time, but haven't gotten since the night 2 years ago. So what I'm trying to say here is that Houndmaster feels old school. In terms of who she is and how she's written, she feels a lot more like the original killers we were getting years ago. Killers like Plague, Artist, Blight and Twins. Many of Dead by Daylight's best written killers come from this era of storytelling, and it laid the groundwork for large-scale entity-related storytelling like the casting of Frank Stone. But how does the Houndmaster's lore measure up to her predecessors? That's what we'll be talking about today. We'll be going through the Houndmaster's lore to see how she stands, starting with a synopsis and then picking through what it tells us about her character and her implications for Dead by Daylight's wider storytelling. There's a lot to cover, so let's dig in. Portia May grew up in the Caribbean, the daughter of a pioneer who helped found a settlement by the name of Fortune. Her father wanted Portia to share in his wanderlust and love for life, that she was brought up on myths, legends and classical literature, and taken with him on his trips overseas. On one of those trips, Portia and her father brought back a litter of Corso puppies, which is a dog breed known for being loyal guard dogs and useful in hunting for large game animals. One of these puppies, the runt of the litter, the 11-year-old Portia named Snug. Before they could make it back to Fortune, they were attacked by a band of pirates, led by the infamous freebooter Mad Molak. Portia's father was killed by Molak and their ship taken hostage, with Portia instructed to lead them back home to Fortune so they could pillage and plunder her home. But with the knowledge of navigation by the stars that her father passed down to her, she led them somewhere else entirely. The Dragon's Tooth. A place which an add-on description that Portia has implies is known nowadays as the Bermuda Triangle. Sure enough, a violent storm seized both Molak's ship and Portia's vessel, the Nightstream. Molak abandoned course, but Portia attempted to fight through the storm to be free of him, only for the Nightstream to capsize in the typhoon and for her to be washed ashore by the waves. Portia awoke, marooned on a strange island in the Dragon's Tooth, but she was not alone. The puppy Snug woke her up, guided her to a meal of coconuts and seaweed, and would remain her constant companion as Portia began her new life in the Dragon's Tooth. The island with its strange purple seaweed and stranger inhabitants was not like the faraway lands from her father's stories. It was populated by monsters and madmen the likes of which Portia had never seen before, and it made every day on the island a battle for survival that she and Snug fought together. Her father had believed it was almost a limbo-like space, an overlap, if you will, between our world and a world of madness and evil. Hey, is that starting to sound familiar to anybody else? As she and Snug grew into adulthood, they built up a fearsome reputation among the island's other residents, until one day Portia found something she thought she would never see again. The Nightstream restored, drifting off the coastline in a cold, black fog. Portia seized the ship, and after banging some heads together, turned a band of would-be assailants into the Nightstream's new crew. But there was someone important missing. Snug. Unable to find him after days of searching, Portia and her crew sailed out of the Dragon's Tooth. But at the back of Portia's mind there was a face she could never forget. An image seared into her brain on a dark and stormy night when she was just a young girl. Molak. And Portia wanted revenge. She spent decades a terror on the high seas, a pirate captain targeting other pirates on the hunt for Molak. But even as the bodies piled up, Portia felt something nagging in her. A ravenous bloodthirst that could only be sated by Molak's head on a spike. So after quelling a mutiny brought on by her crew who were terrified of her degrading mental state, Portia redoubled her efforts and eventually found what she was looking for. When Molak arrived at his island stronghold after an evening of plundering, he found Portia waiting for him, putting on the guise of a gracious but enigmatic guest, offering gold, jewels, and a veritable feast for the pirate warlord. But when Portia revealed exactly what Molak had just tucked into, he turned white as a sheet. His own son, roasted like a pig with his head served on a golden platter. Talk about a doomed course. But before she could enjoy her victory and finish Molak off, a black fog that looked all too familiar snatched the panic-stricken Molak away. And Portia would not have that. Molak was her quarry, years in the making, and she would not permit him to get away now. She followed Molak into the gloom, but instead of the craven pirate king, she found someone else waiting for her. Someone she had not seen in a very long time. Portia and Snug, reunited at last after decades apart. Molak's scent was in the air, the hunt was on, and thus the entity took Portia May and Snug for its own. But before we continue, I want to talk to you about today's video sponsor, FlexiSpot, whose high-quality standing desks will improve any working or gaming space. Even before FlexiSpot reached out to me, I've been familiar with their desks. My mum has used one ever since COVID as a centrepiece of her home office, and I was always a bit jealous, but when FlexiSpot sent me one of my own, well, let me just show you. This here is the new FlexiSpot E9 standing desk, and it really is a thing of beauty. I'm going to be moving into a new flat soon, and when I do, my entire setup is being rebuilt around this. Thanks to the E9's brushless motors and 4 programmable height settings that I can have memorise, I can set an ideal standing height for when I'm writing or recording audio, and a sitting height for when I'm locked in editing or gaming. In my opinion, there is no workspace the FlexiSpot E9 could not improve, and it's a great investment thanks to the insane build quality at work here. The E9 comes with a 20-year warranty and estimated lifespan of 71 years, meaning by the time you'll need a new one of these, half of Florida will be underwater due to global warming. And with a maximum capacity of 180 kilograms, it's got more than enough sturdiness to accommodate whatever you might need. FlexiSpot's Black Friday sale is on at the moment, so follow the link in the description and pinned comment to upgrade your gaming or workspace with the last word in modern standing desks. Let's get back to Houndmaster, shall we? So that's the lore. And true to behaviour's typical fashion for originals these days, there is so much of it to talk about. Houndmaster is another historical domain killer cut from the same cloth as Blight, Deathslinger, Oni, Plague and Twins, many of which have gone down as some of DBD's best written characters. And Houndmaster comes from a time and place we've not really explored in Dead by Daylight before. The Caribbean, during the golden age of piracy. Yeah, she's a literal pirate of the Caribbean.
To be the best pirate I've ever seen.
And while her power isn't necessarily illustrative of what we think of when we think pirate killer, you can see it in her design, especially in her clothing. Similar to how Knight combined elements of dark fantasy like Dark Souls with actual historical armour for his design, Portia leans heavily on fantastical or mythological depictions of pirates for her visual design. She wears lots of jewels and finery decorated with skulls and cutlasses, which is definitely more ostentatious and flashy than most historical pirates, but that actually makes a lot of sense when you think about her story itself. Many real historical pirates started out as legitimate sailors or men-at-arms in the Navy, and as such dressed more like conventional mariners at the time. But that's not where Portia got her start. In her lore, she was the daughter of a colony founder who preyed on other pirates once she took to the seas. It only makes sense that someone like her would take the best and fanciest stuff she could find from the freebooters she attacked, and would want to show that wealth off. If Molak hadn't attacked her father's ship, she could have lived a comfortable and potentially privileged life as the queenpin of fortune in succession of her father, so it's no surprise that she has a bit of a taste for the finer things in life. Houndmaster feels like a pirate in the same way that Deathslinger feels like a cowboy. Both of them display traits and tropes that people familiar with the archetype will notice, but they're ultimately accessories that allow behaviour to tell their own stories, set around or based off existing stories and real historical events and people. Portia's story especially reminds me of the tale of Charlotte de Berry, a probably fictitious French pirate in the 16th century who, as the story goes, snuck on board a ship disguised as a man to fight alongside her husband before he was killed by an officer who wanted de Berry for himself. She killed the officer and escaped the ship, only to be abducted by the captain of a merchant ship and stolen away from the docks as his prisoner. She earned the respect of his crew and led a mutiny, decapitating the merchant before taking command of the ship herself and leading a successful pirate career for years to come. Portia's role in her story reminds me a lot of the tale of Charlotte de Berry. Both of them were women who were brought to sea by men close to them before their deaths drove these women to take revenge and ultimately take command of their own ship by a mixture of hard-earned respect and their fair share of brutal violence. There are tons of stories like these of female pirates taking command and proving themselves to be more than capable of running things themselves. Mostly fictitious, but some real, like the Chinese pirate queen Qing Shi. And Portia owes homage to all of them, with Dead by Daylight's obligatory horror twist, of course. Houndmaster's story is a tale of cruelty and vengeance on the high seas, where Portia occupies a more morally ambiguous role than most of our killers, especially the female ones. Dead by Daylight's female killers have a general history of being written as victims of circumstance first and foremost, often being good people who never even took a life before entering the fog. And the trend was only really bucked by Skull Merchant, who was a literal comic book villain. Portia sits somewhere in the middle. She's definitely caused a lot of harm throughout her life, doesn't seem to regret any of it, and a lot of it was probably necessary, but she's still a product of her environment. She doesn't kill out of, say, boredom, but out of a desire to get revenge for the wrongs inflicted on her. If I was to compare her to any other killer in terms of motivations and moral ambiguity, I would compare her very closely to the Deathslinger. Both were driven by a burning hatred of those who exploited and harmed them. But while Deathslinger's hatred is a symptom of a system of private incarceration and capital exploitation that he eventually became a part of, Portia's revenge is more personal, as reflected in her obsession with Molak. From the age of 11, every act in Portia's life is driven by a burning desire to get revenge on Molak, who killed her father in cold blood and tried to use her to burn everything she loved to the ground. Even from her first action as a little girl, she's established as a woman of focus, commitment, and sheer fucking will, when she defies Molak and plots a course into the Dragon's Tooth instead of running home to fortune. At any time, Molak could have realised what she was doing and done literally anything to her as punishment. She was totally at his mercy, but still chose to defy him, even if it cost her her last breath. It's not even presented as some sort of moral choice to sacrifice herself and save the people of fortune from what Molak was going to do to them. She wanted Molak dead, and she was willing to doom herself to the waters of the Dragon's Tooth if she could drag him down with her. This bitter defiance is carried throughout her story to the point of becoming her defining trait. When she grows up first as a castaway and then as a pirate captain, Molak's memory continues to haunt her to the point that she sees him everywhere. When she fights back against the castaway's ambush or defends herself from her mutinous crew, it's not their faces she sees, but Molak's staring back at her. He casts a long shadow over her life, even though, as we find out later, he doesn't even remember who she is or what she looks like, and the permanence of his memory through all of Portia's life reaffirms her defiant spirit. She lives on in spite of him, out of a bottomless well of resentment and hatred that begs to be filled with his spilled blood. For what it's worth, revenge horror is so common that it's basically its own subgenre, and with the appropriate piratey veneer, Portia fits right in. The subgenre was codified in 1978's I Spit on Your Grave, which is a movie I can't say I exactly love, and it doesn't help that the movie's influence has mired the revenge horror trope irreversibly with, often graphic depictions of rape, which is an angle I'm very, very glad they didn't go for with Portia's story. But with that angle aside, you could practically call Portia's story I Spit on Your Waves for how good a tonal fit it is with that classic piece of horror cinema and the movies that would follow it. My favourite revenge horror movies are Revenge, by the director of The Substance, Coralie Fargit, which, in my opinion, does the rape and revenge narrative far, far better than I Spit on Your Grave, and Nick Cage's Mandy is a fantastic take on the formula as well. So if you're looking for movie recommendations to scratch the same itch as Portia's story, I really advise taking a look at those. The haunting visions Portia has of Molak that follow her around throughout her life come alongside a kind of bloodlust that Portia felt ever since that fateful night. a ravenous desire to kill and torture anyone who got in her way. The initial implication here is that this is a direct result of the entity's influence since she washed up on that island in the Dragon's Tooth. After all, what is the entity if not darkness embodied and nourished by the spilling of blood? But I didn't believe that the damage that's been done to Portia's mental state and perception of reality is entirely the entity's doing, far from it. Let's not forget, by every metric, Molak did ruin Portia's life. He killed her father, tried to do the same to everyone she loved back home in Fortune, and left her for dead in the Dragon's Tooth, where she would never have seen her home again. She sees Molak everywhere, as if she's constantly reliving the night he attacked, and I interpret this element of her story as kind of an analogue for PTSD. In effect, Portia is reliving the struggle against Molak every day, and the entity's twisted that trauma he inflicted on Portia to its own ends. It drives her to violent and cruel acts against anyone who crosses her, as a substitute for her real target, the man who destroyed her life. I love the ambiguity introduced here, when we're not sure how much of Portia's paranoia and violent tendencies comes from the trauma she was put through at such a young age, and how much is the entity's manipulation. Whether the darkness eating away at her like a parasite is the entity literally demanding bloodshed to satiate itself, or whether it's more of a metaphor for Portia's unmet need for vengeance. I personally believe it's a little bit of both. Molak did more than actively ruin her life. He left a permanent mark on Portia's mental state, and the entity's actively using that flaw to its advantage to get what it wants out of her. Just like how it leveraged the Plague's desperation to save her people in order to secure her service and devotion. The entity does not tend to create flaws in and of itself, but instead prefers to exploit the flaws that we as humans already have, and Portia's lingering trauma and defiant spirit provided the perfect fuel for the entity to set alight. As to how it did that, well, we'll get to that later. Behaviour could have ended it here and just kept Portia as a violent and vengeful woman who's out for blood after the entity latched onto her trauma for its own ends. And she would have been a fine character. Nothing revolutionary, but fine. But what makes Houndmaster special here is that she's way more than a one-dimensional embodiment of seething anger and bloody revenge. She's still a resourceful and professional leader of men and animals alike, and there's plenty in her story to showcase that. It's not just her defiance of Molak when she was a little girl. She survived the horrors of the Dragon's Tooth for years with only Snug at her side, and concocted the ultimate revenge scheme to get back at Molak in a way that's both sickening and legitimately impressive in its inventiveness. Even at her worst, when she's in the red mist and killing anyone in her way, she holds herself together enough to leave a few survivors if doing so would be expedient to her ends. Far from the mindless berserker she could easily have come across as, Portia displays the perfect balance of unpredictably violent and cunning and calculating. The kind of person who would reasonably be feared by her crew, even though you can still see why they signed on with her in the first place. And her ability to maintain control, even when the spirits are high in the heat of battle, is reflected in her animations and voice lines in the trial itself. Her voice lines and delivery affirm that in the trial she's clearly having a good time, constantly laughing, insulting the survivors, or cooing to Snug about how he's such a good boy. But with her body language and the instant obedience she commands in Snug, you can tell that doesn't come at the cost of her authority, awareness, and control. There's so many little moments in-game where Portia is allowed to express this side of her character, tapping her cane on the ground just once to instantly call Snug off the survivor in her Mori, the two distinct whistles she gives when instructing Snug to chase or search, and even in the lobby when she commands Snug to maintain his focus on the survivors. The bond between woman and dog is one forged out of trust, loyalty, and the constant control that Portia has learned to exert over this aggressive and vicious animal. Even when the blood runs hot and the red mist is upon them both, Portia is able to maintain effortless control. And it affirms to you, the player, that yes, the Houndmaster knows exactly what she's doing. Before we wrap up though, I want to talk for a little bit about her relationship with the entity and what exactly happened on that island in the Dragon's Tooth that let the entity in, because it offers some interesting questions about Snug and ties her to the new survivor in the chapter, Tori Kane. The island in the Dragon's Tooth where Portia was marooned is all but stated to be an overlap, where the barrier in between the entity's realm and the real world wears extremely thin. We've seen places like this many times before, such as Greenville Theatre where Sable was taken, Crotus Pren Asylum where the nurse worked and where Nia was taken, and the Garden of Joy where Otto Stamper's massacre took place that led to the creation of the Dredge. Hattie Core can sense and open these overlaps and makes exploring them and fighting what she finds inside her job as the host of the Ravagers of the Abyss podcast. Effectively, Portia and Snug lived for years on the doorstep of the entity's realm, surviving on whatever beasts and monsters emerged from the darkness, and with tenacity, grit and the strength of their bond, the two managed to carve out an existence there, in the intermediary space at the gates of hell itself. This is likely where the entity got its claws into Portia, and why it drives her to acts of violence even before she was taken as a killer. She spent years effectively pickled in the auric particles that make up the entity's realm. No wonder she took a little bit of it back with her to the real world. It's interesting, I think, that the Dragon's Tooth Island is implied to be within the Bermuda Triangle because it offers an interesting suggestion as to why this island of all places is an overlap with the realm of the entity. Overlaps appear in places where trauma and horror coalesce and pool to wear down the gap between realities. And if the Bermuda Triangle naturally causes ships and planes to crash and run aground, all the trauma and death that takes place here could be enough to open a naturally occurring overlap with the entity's realm. Ships crash, people wash up on the island, their deaths and desperation cause a rift to be formed. Or it could be the other way around even, that the entity's proximity through the overlap is what's causing these disasters. But whichever it is, that's up to you. Regardless, the overlap in the Dragon's Tooth is what allowed the entity to exert its influence over Portia's life, and I think was the key to why Snug and her have been reunited in the entity's realm. Hey, do you guys remember when I was going through the story at the beginning, and Snug disappeared without a trace as Portia prepared to leave the island? Well, the language used in the story itself has caused some people to infer that the Snug that Portia grew up with on the island was never real, just another hallucination. Which would mean that the Snug we see in DBD is an entity construct designed to keep Portia in line. But I don't believe that's true at all. Snug almost certainly had to have been real. The two fought and killed together for years on that island. So where'd he go? This is where the nature of the island as an overlap comes in. I believe the entity took Snug a very long time before it took Portia, and she was looking for him on the beach before finding the Night's Dream because he had been whisked away by the entity into the same black fog that the ship had emerged from. It would explain why Snug doesn't seem to have changed despite the decades since Portia left the island. Time does not flow in a linear fashion between the entity's realm and the real world, so what had been decades of Portia could have just been a few hours for Snug. Similar to Charlotte being allowed to reunite with Victor in the realm, Portia and Snug's story has a somewhat bittersweet ending. Yes, they are stuck as the immortal minions of an ever-hungering god of suffering that might just find themselves discarded to the void the moment they're no longer of use, but at least for now, they have each other again. Dead by Daylight movie, audition tape, take 1. Catch! Let's see how he does. Looks pretty good to me. Good boy. Well done. Yes. You got the socks, survivor. Well done. And the back pouches. What do you reckon, Victor? What do you make of it? Oh, hello. So, in summary, I believe that from a character and lore perspective, Houndmaster has been exquisitely crafted, and the attention to detail shines through everywhere. The emotional intelligence and moral greyness of the lore, the animations and voice lines in the trial, the ambiguous details around the entity's involvement, the fact that you can pet the damn dog. It all just clicks together to make a character that feels so perfectly complete. You want to talk about attention to detail? It says at the start of her lore that her father brought her up on stories like 1001 Arabian Nights, Greek mythology and the works of Shakespeare. And now check out the dog's names from a little bit later in the story. Caesar, King, Shah, Athena and Snug. Athena is the Greek goddess of wisdom and warfare, perhaps a figure that would resonate with the leadership role Portia would play later in her life. Shah is short for Shahryar, the king from 1001 Arabian Nights, and Caesar, Snug, and King are presumably named after Shakespeare's characters in Julius Caesar, A Midsummer Night's Dream, and King Lear respectively. She's done what every 11-year-old in history has done, and named her pets after her favourite fictional characters. I just love that. It's a nice detail that's so easily missed, and yeah, you can really tell this killer was a labour of love. When I look at the Houndmaster, I see a fusion of the old and the new, with story elements and a character style reminiscent of older killers, but given the polish and in-trial faithfulness of the newer members of the cast, smelted together like an alloy and rendered all the stronger for it. I said that Dracula was the gold standard for licensed characters going forwards in my video on Castlevania, and I'll mirror that sentiment here. Houndmaster is one of the best made original killers we've ever had, and if future original chapters are made with the same level of care, attention and intelligence that was behind the making of the Houndmaster, I'd be happy to never get another licensed chapter again. It's been no secret that my love for Dead by Daylight and especially its lore is not what it once was. A large part of that is down to the huge number of licensed chapters we've been getting lately, and part of it is because the originals that we've gotten in this time just haven't captured my interest. DBD's original lore for new characters has been on a general downturn for a while now. Dredge, I think, was the last killer whose lore I was earnestly really clocked in for, and that was 2.5 years ago. Skull Merchant doesn't count. She consumed my brain like an illithid that feeds on autism, so she's an outlier. She's a special little princess. Even though we know the next two killers are licensed and based on the leaks and what's been confirmed, I'm not excited about what we're going to be getting. The Houndmaster's story and her power being so damn good gives me hope for the future of original killers. There will come a time when the licensed gravy train starts to slow down and we get more original killers again, and when that time comes, I will be overjoyed if they get the same level of care, attention and thought put into the stories as Houndmaster got. And do you want to know the best bit? I think the new Survivors lore might be even better. So that's everything I have to say about the Houndmaster, or at least about her lore. The more time I spent on this PTB, the more I realised how much I really was coming to enjoy this killer. Turns out the best way to get me to enjoy a Dash killer was just to make them Pinhead. I'm already working on a guide for this killer, and we don't even know what buff she's going to be getting from the PTB. This is going to be fun. But I have a lot more videos looking to come out before then, so if you're interested then please do subscribe. I've got a video on trap killers that'll be coming out very very soon, followed by a lore video on the new Survivor Tori Kane. So yeah, that'll be fun I think. Patrons got to see this video a day early, so if you're interested in that and a bunch of other interesting perks, then pop on by my Patreon and slide me some cash, because they really do help keep the lights on around here. And let's not forget today's sponsor FlexiSpot, whose Black Friday sale can still be found in the description or in the pinned comment. Alright everyone, cheerio, and I'll see you next time.